Hello and welcome to today's dialogue. So today I am watching a different YouTube video that came up on my feed with a podcaster I've never listened to and a guest that I've never heard of. And this is what often happens when I start to go into the rabbit hole of YouTube educational content, especially as it's related to getting into extraordinary experiences. And yesterday I was talking about a man named Dr. Jeffrey Kripal. I was calling him Kripal because I wasn't paying attention to the pronunciation, unfortunately. Sorry. And the video is called What If Science Took the Paranormal Seriously? The Superhumanities, Professor Jeffrey Kripal. And the podcast is Essentia Foundation, and the interviewer is Busstra. And I really enjoyed it. And then yesterday I was talking about how I had the urge to reach out to this person and be like, blah, blah, blah. And I could imagine myself spending an hour typing up an email or something. And then I didn't do that. And part of the reason is because he's not including people. He might include people who have a diagnosis, but he didn't specifically mention that, though he might in his work. I'm not saying he doesn't, but it wasn't really the theme of his talk. So the talk is like an hour and 49 minutes, the interview. And so I'm sharing this because today I'm listening to something that just showed up on my feed. And that's why I think reality in the universe and AI and algorithms, it's all the same thing. And it's listening, whether it's technology or whether it's Gaia or both. But this one that came up today is a podcast called Third Eye Drops. And the guest's name is Tom Mate. Or Matt, I don't know. And it's called Synchronicity, Ancient Wisdom, Carl Jung, and the Hidden Dimension. And so I click on this, and this is why this one's like a little bit more relevant, because the interview is 2 hours long, and the guest, the context of his background is that, well, basically he has a superpower. No, he has a superhumanity ability, sort of like the last guest, Dr. Kripal, was saying, oh, we have these superhumanities, it's 1%, yada yada, it's meaningful. So here's a guy, Tom Mate, saying, I have this superhuman thing going on, and I'm actually working with certain labs to do tests to see if what I'm experiencing is kind of real, or they can tell that I'm experiencing it even though they can't see it themselves. And then if they can tell that I'm experiencing it, means it's real, and I'm sensing something that is real that most people can't sense. So what he senses is holographic images of different shapes and different things that he can kind of call on as part of his perception, like basically turning on the ability of what he calls upsight. So being able to, maybe see things that other people can't see, that's sort of above what we can usually see. Don't know if that's how he describes it, but he describes the experience as seeing these holograms, and he's also sharing that by seeing them and having a mathematical interest now, after some of his experiences, which I'll briefly share, he's able to derive equations from them. And then he has somebody in his family who's a mathematician who says, yes, this is a valid equation, blah, 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 and they can have conversations about it. And so the reason why this person talking for 2 hours is even more interesting is because basically they did have a full-on psychosis. They were in like full-on addiction and psychosis, or I don't remember the order of it. Had a full-on psychotic break, and it says actually after an intense bender, he had a psychotic break and lost everything. He eventually recovered. I think it took him like 2 years or more to recover. But he was successful before, had this break, and then recovered and still had this ability. Now, I haven't read his book and his story, so I don't know if he had abilities and then lost them, or if he didn't have any real like solid abilities during the state of psychosis, but was able to re-uncover it in a way. So he's an example of somebody who was able to keep or re-uncover the abilities that one might have had or tasted in those states. Or it could be that through experiencing those states and having a breakdown of the usual mental models and structures, that allowed space for some other capacity to come in. Because, it seems like there's energetic trade-offs where some form of functionality that we call normal and good and all this has to kind of dwindle and atrophy to allow something else to take up that space. Or it could be different space, but it required energy in order to grow. And that doesn't mean other functionalities can't come back after. It's sort of like if you have a car accident, you might be injured for a long time, but you can eventually learn to walk again, like if everything goes well. Or talk again, or these things, we can learn to do them again. Well, with this other thing, when these functions, like imagine if you had an accident and you were laying and you couldn't do anything for 2 months, all of a sudden you grew another arm. Of course, that's not going to happen. But this is kind of what happens with the brain. It's like when we have these breakdowns and it's literally breaking the structures of our ego, psyche, and our body map and everything and how it all relates to some degree. It garbles it or dilutes it or whatever it does. It allows for something else to come in. And when those other structures sort of come back and take more solidity, kind of become more neuroplastic instead of the brain becoming like this fluid crystal, like a caterpillar in a chrysalis. Like I think the brain might become like a caterpillar in a chrysalis in these states. And then it can eventually, again, learn to walk. Like think about the caterpillar. It can walk, right? And it has legs. But its legs are different than the butterfly legs, and the butterfly can also walk, but walking's not its primary mechanism of motility because now it has wings and it can fly. So I think the same kind of thing happens with the brain. So just because people go through this crisis and the way that it's handled and approached and seen now makes it so it turns into like a disabled caterpillar with like chunks of the chrysalis stuck to its body, going through life looking like, what happened to you? If it was approached differently, because, the caterpillar is lucky. It can make the chrysalis and hide it under a tree. Us humans, when we go into this chrysalis and it's in our brain, can't see that that's happening. We look all crazy and we're in society and people just call us nuts. But like literally our brain is like rearranging, trying to make space for new capacities. And in the meantime, we can't do the whole socially contrived clock of the 9 to 5 and all these things that we may or may not have been able to do before, depending on our age and our development previously. So, and I think this happens sort of like, some young people, they go through puberty at like 8, and some people go through puberty at like 17. With this chrysalis in the brain, like we don't know if it's going to happen to somebody in their 14 or they're 80. And it may not happen. So it's a developmental thing that may or may not happen. And, just like when teenagers are going through puberty, they might have been like this really sweet child, so loving and caring. And then they have this, change in their body and hormones. And, all of a sudden they turn into like terrible teenagers. And we don't say, well, there's still a lot of struggles, of course, but we don't say, oh, they're just like every teenager in puberty is mentally ill. No, we don't say that. And so what I'm trying to say is, we don't have a safe chrysalis. And this is why I advocate for myself, and I learned to do this to keep to myself when my brain is having this chrysalis event happening, and stay in the chrysalis of my own space, because I'm going to be misinterpreted out in society. And even if my chrysalis brain is happening and I'm in my own space, I probably won't do behavior X, Y, Z. Whereas if I'm out in society, I might be acted upon to react with behavior X, Y, Z that wouldn't happen if I kept myself safe in my chrysalis, right? So if a caterpillar's in a chrysalis in a tree, it might be dreaming of like wandering around on the leaves and then getting eaten by a bird. but it didn't actually happen because it's safe and it's chrysalis, right? So we might have scary experiences or ecstatic experiences in our chrysalis space, in our safe space. And then that's, we're safe. Nobody's going to see that and misinterpret it. Now, if society understood these things, then it might not necessarily be a problem. And there's cultures and maybe times where these things were understood. And I'm even seeing like how it's possible. And it was true that this was seen, a lot of these things were seen as, say, religious experiences back when religion was the common framework. And now I feel like because we're separated from religion being the main thing, I'm not saying it should be the main thing again, and now science is the main thing, we get consumed by the scientific system, which almost seems worse for people who are going through these things, depending on how it is. Of course, it's kind of like luck of the draw, right? Because people nowadays can have an experience and get through it, like this guy, Tom Mate, and him coming through an experience like that with some kind of superhuman ability intact and still happening, that he has the ability to, quote, control, and he's saying it's happening. Nobody can see it happening, though some of the equations he might derive from it happening are artifacts of him seeing something, perhaps. So, that's why I'm saying this conversation is like the next level. And that's why by listening to these conversations and then saying, no, that's not quite it, is helpful, because then the universe can be like, okay, well, what about this one? And, in my mind, if society was like a chrysalis metamorphosis friendly society, I would not be sitting here watching people on the computer talking about their extraordinary experiences. We would be out in the world having these experiences sometimes. It wouldn't be a big deal. And then sharing about it. Like, hey, do you see that like big, huge human-sized butterfly over there? No? Oh, cool. I do. Like, I must be processing in this way. I must be experiencing upsight. We would be able to dialogue with each other in such a way to see if it was a shared thing. And one of the things I'm really liking about this video so far, and I've listened to about 45 minutes, is the comments. Because there's so many people saying, oh, I had these types of experiences. And they're saying, like, this went on for 3 years after I smoked some weed, or this went on and I didn't take anything. And I would see these things on the ceiling and my whole room would be filled with math equations. So people are talking about experiences of seeing things that weren't really there. And it made me think about how, there's the hearing voices movement, and it's been around for quite a long time. And it's for people who hear voices, who may or may not have been diagnosed with something, and they make no assumption of diagnosis, and they're saying voice hearing isn't necessarily requiring a diagnosis, and, it may have a diagnosis. People might have happened to be diagnosed, but they're saying it's kind of like a, quote, normal experience. And so this was not my first time, but of seeing people sharing their visual experiences, right? I don't think there's the same level of recognition of hearing or seeing visual stuff, right? And talking about that. And last summer when I went to an event, it was interesting that somehow people started talking about, at least I had some conversations about, how do you process information? Do you see images in your mind? Do you think in words? Like, do you hear your voice talking, or do you hear other people talking, or do you hear your thought in someone else's voice? And we just don't even have this conversation. We just, in general, there's this assumption, maybe we make these assumptions that everyone experiences the world like we do. And I think in this conversation with Tom Mate, he's talking about how we have an umwelt, or like, the umwelt of a caterpillar, how it goes through life is much different than a human. But even humans have different experiences of how they go through things. So I just browsed through some of the comments, and it's quite amazing how many people have these visual type experiences of seeing things outside that aren't really there, but they are there for them. And some of them, make sense, some of them don't. And some people are like, yeah, it lasted for 3 years. There was a common theme where some people said they were glad it went away, because it seems scary. Even if it wasn't scary per se, it's still kind of scary to not know what that's all about. And then one of the commenters said, oh, this one part still remains and I'm glad the rest is gone because it was kind of scary. And then it also made me see how, like, we just don't talk about these things, right? I think talking about hearing a voice, we're getting there with that a bit, but talking about seeing something that's not there is almost more taboo, because it's literally questioning, like, what is reality made of? Because we're such visual creatures if we're seeing something that other people can't see. Whereas voices, sound is a bit more passive. Like, we hear sounds all the time that some of them our brain might be making up and we don't even know. So I found that interesting, and that is something that I think is cool. Like, if people would start to talk about that more, like how they process information. And so that brought me back to myself and my self-dialogue process, which is, talking about how I process information. As part of it, like, this man, Tom, he says that he can conjure up an image in his mind's eye. And he's saying what he experiences isn't mind's eye. It's outside of his mind, like in space and time. Now, and then with the studies they're doing, that they can kind of measure the difference. Now, for me, I can't even conjure up an image in my mind's eye. I can't even do that. Sometimes I see things out in space. Sometimes I see something in my mind's eye. I can see things in my mind's eye in a dream, but it's not a dream. I'm still awake, but it takes up the whole space. It's like what I am just translates into that kind of two-dimensional dream image. So I have all these different kind of things going on. Not only that, I've talked at length about how I sense language. And this is something I ended up writing a quick article about yesterday, because I was reading a really interesting article about gamification, and how it's basically about how gamification is going to destroy humanity, because they can make games so addictive, and then we start chasing like points and scores and measures and steps that don't actually matter. But it becomes addictive because we're like competing with other people and so many different things. So in short, I took the word gamification and I looked at it. I could tell the word manic was in there, like within the word gamification. So I crossed out manic and I was left with some letters, and I took out the word gait, which is like walking, right? Moving forward, taking steps. And then the last three letters left were FIO. And I looked that up. And in Latin, that means I make. I make. So I put that together and I put FIO, manic, gait, or even FIO, gait, manic, which is I make steps or step manic, right? And so to me, within the word gamification was the solution to someone like myself, or perhaps anyone, falling into the trap of these types of games, which is making your steps manic, meaning you can unfold that in so many ways, but spontaneity, synchronicity, basically being so immersed in life that, like, imagine if you've been in mania. You don't want to play games. You don't want to be on the computer. There could be reasons to be on the computer, but it's not like a primary thing. At some points, I actually couldn't even be on the computer. It felt like it was transporting me, probably now that I think about it, into the past, where computers were seen as a necessary object to use. Whereas in that sort of future state of consciousness, you're very immersed in life, right? And so anyways, within the word gamification, you kind of solved that. And that FIO manic gait is kind of like what the magical backpack is that I talk about wanting to do, where kind of go out and be manic intentionally. But in small doses where I can come back to my space and not get too excited about things. It could even be to the point where I'm wandering around and have like one friendly stranger conversation. And then they're like, hey, let's go to Europe tomorrow. And I'd be like, no, thanks, bye. Like, I wouldn't go with it. That would be the point. Because that's when it gets, like, you kind of go into the future when you do that, instead of touching the future and inviting the future into the now. It's sort of like going out and getting just to that point of future consciousness with somebody and then retreating. So then you don't kind of go into this magic world and create a magic world with a stranger. You can do that, but it just leads to trouble eventually, I think, because the world is just not designed for that. It's designed how it's designed. So from reading that article, I did that little, I think they're called anagrams or whatever, but I use that. And that's part of my game. It's like looking at words, playing with words, making up words, combining words, creating words that seem more coherent and congruent. And that's part of my game of what I do. And I could even like say to myself, this is a power that I had when I first went into mania, and it's a power that I still have after mania. Now, is this super important in the whole grand scheme of the world? Probably not. But it's fun for me. It's a fun game. And it's a game I created within myself, for myself. And I didn't really create this game. I was given this game by Gaia. Just like Tom was given what game he's playing. And he wasn't calling it a game. I'm just relating these things. I like to weave things together. That's part of my game. And it's very meaningful for me. It feels meaningful. And that game of subjectively creating meaning is meaningful. So let's talk a little bit more about Dr. Jeffrey Kripal and then also about Tom Mate. So I revisited a little bit of Dr. Kripal's interview, and here's a quote. He said, "I think the humanities want to talk about everything in terms of society, and I think it's fair and truthful to about 99% of our experience. But that other part of the human condition, that 1%, or that percentage of a percentage, actually ends up meaning pretty much everything." So this is really important, right? And he's talking about the humanities because he works in the humanities, and then he's trying to create this awareness or this area or bringing this 1% of the superhumanities, of this part that we pretty much just explain away or ignore, into academia, right? Now, whether or not it gets brought into academia or not, that's not really my thing, though I do like to use what academia is saying, including this very quote by Dr. Kripal, to say, yeah, this is the same, except I'm really immersed in this 1%, because it does end up meaning pretty much everything. It does. But then if it does, why are we not talking more about it to the point where a certain percentage of our conversation or dialogue with other people revolves around this type of thing? Now, who knows if that'll happen? But that's why I spend a certain percentage of my own time having a dialogue with myself to revolve some of my life linguistically, like literally speaking in self-dialogue about these things, and also bringing in these other videos and things. And so it doesn't have to just be 1%. It actually can be a lot larger part of one's life. And another point that he brought in is that he says, quote, he said, the 0 point is this physical, is this mainstream that is never questioned. According to material, I don't think the thing translated well. So anyways, he's basically saying that materialism has colonized reality. And he talks about decolonizing reality. And he says, quote, look, you can't pretend you're being diverse and then turn everyone into a good Marxist, because that's your metaphysics. That's European Marxist criticism from the 19th and 20th century. If you're really going to believe in if you're really going to be diverse, this is the key. If you're really going to be diverse, you have to take these other experiences as ontological claims, as claims on reality. So these other ontological experiences or claims, like these basically extraordinary experiences, as claims on reality. Now, he's saying that that's what the humanities has to do, right? But imagine if that's what we did in general. That alone would completely eliminate the mental illness framework. Now, of course, there would still be people that, need help and support and everything. But basically, imagine saying, this happened, this happened, this happened. I saw this. I saw Jesus. Then I did this, blah, blah. And people pretty much just believing you right off the bat without even questioning it. Because we can have these experiences. These are part of the percentage or percentage of a percentage, and I'm not to say everyone has that in their lifetime, but it can happen to anyone at any age, right? But as soon as we start talking about it, then we can be pathologized. And this is the part that wasn't brought up in Dr. Kripal's talk. And, I don't know, it's not really the theme so far of Tom Matte's talk either, because, he went through psychosis and he was maybe diagnosed with psychosis at some point, but he's not even focused on that. He's focused on the fact that he got through it and now has this gift, right? So he's actually having a gift, he's embodying it, and he's, sharing it and trying to find proofs and reasons of it and stuff like that. So I just want to bring in, there was one comment that I read in the talk so far with Tom Matte, where someone was saying they were basically having these same experiences as Tom Matte. And the commenter said the closest they could find something in the DSM was thought broadcasting. He said, but it wasn't just thoughts, it was related with experience and everything. And they even went to a doctor and a psychiatrist and everything. And the psychiatrist said, yeah, this sounds like schizophrenia, but we can't diagnose you with schizophrenia because you know that it's not real. Now, this is an important point. Yes, it's troublesome when there are people they don't. But imagine a world where these ontological claims were seen as claims on reality, not just claims, not just automatically meaning that somebody has a mental illness, right? Or maybe they don't automatically have one, but if somebody admits, well, it's not real, meaning I'm not going to take it seriously, I'm not going to try to turn it into a superpower or a gift, I'm going to resist it, I'm going to hope it goes away, I'm going to continue to function in society as it is because this has nothing to do with meaning that maybe I should rearrange my mental models in order to whatever. And so I've talked with myself before about how I do think that if you don't accept the call of what these things are trying to tell us and have us learn, and it could be different lessons and different mental models for different people because they're in a different character, different place in the game of life, it eventually will kind of go away. It'll be okay, you want to have the mainstream type of life, it will eventually go away. So you can think, oh, my psychosis healed and now I'm back to normal or whatever. For people who don't end up with the whole long-term mental illness and, in the system and medicated. To me, it seems like whether it's voice hearing or whether it's seeing these visions and having these experiences, there's a certain percentage of people, quite a lot, that don't end up with any kind of diagnosis. It's almost like the ones who take it too seriously and say, hey, this is kind of real. Hey, maybe my ontological claims should be claims on reality. These people are called mentally ill because they take it as meaning something. And so the trouble is when we share that and then we get all medicated and stuff, we don't actually have a chance to really metamorphose our brain based on those things. So, in more of a different game theoretic scenario of this, if people had these things going on, they would, back in the day, hundreds and maybe not hundreds of thousands, but thousands of years ago, people would go to like these secret mystery schools where they would start to learn these mysteries. So if you had the mysteries start to turn on in your metamorphic mind, you'd be like, I better find this mystery school. It's going to help me to do the metamorphosis. Because if I say anything in this way to these people, they're going to turn it into like a chemical castration, like basically giving a chemical that it's a chemical chrysalis that keeps the chrysalis intact while the brain is like trying to rearrange and it can't break through the chrysalis. So what it does is just eventually kind of tries to reverse metamorphose to the best of its ability to, and that's why it doesn't work. Like the in this metaphor, that's why these interventions, they can't really work, because it's trying to grow beyond, and part of the growth spurt is that we're going to appear like imagine we're adults. We're going to appear like adult teenagers mixed with children, because the things that we learned through childhood and teenagehood are getting all mixed up and mashed up in order to kind of create a different structure. So there was something I read about retrocausality, and I can't remember who it was, but they were talking about how if you kind of go back and look at your past and change the story about it, you're actually changing the past. There's other ways to do retrocausality, but I do think part of the metamorphosis process of the chrysalis in the brain is this retrocausality, and literally kind of rearranging some of the things that happened or our interpretations of them, and that has like changes in the brain structure. And when some of those links are breaking, that's when some of this stuff can come up and kind of explode out, and then we can get confused about what's happening now or when or then or where we are or who we are. And but that's part of the process, right? It's like having all of a sudden these real somatic releases while the brain is shifting. And I'm not saying I've done experiments or anything like that. Like, I've experienced these things, and I could talk about 10,000 ways that this works, and that's the fun part for me. That's part of what I like to do with my process, and that might not be interesting to other people. People might be like, I want to find the one framework that works for me. For me, I like to find different frameworks and talk about them at different times, because that's sort of what I'm looking at and learning now, or what happens to come up in my consciousness. Because like, I don't really remember anything. Like, I don't even know, maybe I've said these exact things before and I don't know. But it feels new, so that's okay. So back to this point about these other ontological claims as claims on reality. So I take that as, I think ontological means like of being, or however it works, but experiences. So my experience is what I've experienced as my being, in my being, with my being, by being human. If I just do a retrocausal metamorphosis right now and say, okay, everything I experienced was real. All the different things that made no sense according to time, sometimes physical reality, the laws of reality, the laws of physics and biology, and so many different things. Now for me, when I say that, like, I already kind of know that. They were real for me, at least. They could have been real for someone else if they noticed, but it wasn't subjectively part of their story, so they wouldn't have noticed anyway. So the fact of like having to have someone else notice is not really that important. Not only that, something that struck me with this and how, we don't talk about these things in society. It's not part of the conversation. And after reading all these comments, seeing how many people have these, and we don't talk about them, I know people can still make the argument, even with people who are diagnosed, that they believe the stuff. But according to this, like, if they're ontological claims, they should. And the thing is, like, I think that the thing is that if we were having these dialogues as a small fraction of reality, as it's an actual claim on reality from the beginning of humanity, or we might have had these conversations, and indigenous cultures might, and then, you know, with religion coming along, like, then it got separated from actual daily life and put in a building, and then, you know, applied to people rather than like a living dialogue and conversation. If it wouldn't have been separated from life, I don't think there would be this bell curve of, you know, mostly normal people, quote, normal, who don't have it. Or if they do, certain percentage, which is probably the majority that do, the majority of people don't talk about it, you know, because people are afraid that it won't be taken as a claim on reality. It would be taken as a claim against the integrity of their own psyche and personality and humanity, which it is part of our humanity. We're just not allowing it. So what I'm saying is we wouldn't have these like tails of the bell curve where there's a very concentrated number of people who are really like stuck in the beliefs about these things. Because part of the stuck in the belief about it is that nobody's listening, right? So you have to like believe it within yourself and hold on to that, because it's just not this like common thing that people talk about, right? And so in a way you can think, well, oh, that's bad that people get stuck in that or they believe that. But, you know, those might be the people with the strongest ability to eventually communicate the fact that these are claims on reality. So there's lots of different ways to look at it. Like if there wasn't the ability for people to really get convicted in that, like convinced, and then, you know, kind of like convicted by the mental health system, unfortunately, you know, those people would be the strongest experiencers in a different reality that would be able to speak about it much more like intensely and much more in a concentrated way in a reality where the whole time we were talking about it, because, you know, they would have had a natural proclivity to learn more about it, right? So if it was a topic in humanity, like, oh, the 1% of our super humanities, or that would be bigger if we were talking about it all along. And then that person would go along that line of inquiry, which would probably have multiple roles in reality that one could take on that would be more natural than like the religious. I don't know if it's more natural. It's still a possibility that this can happen, that these roles can develop. And, you know, they would naturally be the one because, you know, just as some people have really strong bodies or strong bone structure to be able to play certain sports, and they naturally go to that, or they succeed in it when they do decide to play in it, some people would naturally have the right structure and consciousness to go and embody playing the role of being able to dialogue more about these things. Like they would have a certain maybe role in a school, or maybe make up the teachers of these mystery schools, right? But when you get stuck in a closed loop, and then that closed loop just becomes like believing, right? Like even something like getting a mental illness diagnosis is like a closed loop of like believing how it works. And, you know, for me, I keep the loop open by doing the self-dialogue. So that's why, you know, I don't really buy into this whole like, yeah, these actual people over here are really ill, because I think that if the whole dialogue was opened up in society, all of a sudden these people would feel safe to come up and talk, and they'd be able to have a dialogue, and perhaps then feel safe enough to move back into integrating in society. Like they would I feel they would come up, they would start growing like a tree, like a seed that is waiting for the right environment, right? Now, who knows if and when that will be seen. But the other thing that came up, and this is why this is interesting to me, is that, you know, in between watching a video yesterday with Dr. Kripal and starting to watch this video today with Tom Mate, who's the experiencer, who has the gift, and now, just as an aside, going through this type of experience, each person that goes through this type of experience will have unique experiences and may come out with different gifts. You know, just like in a video game, the game designer can program like thousands of abilities, right? The sky's the limit as like their creative imagination. it could be just as many for humans. Like there might even be like no overlap when we're really in our uniqueness. So I was thinking after watching yesterday's video, and I've written about this before, where, you know, some people seem to have like a circular loop niche where somebody's successful at writing about writing, or someone is successful about speaking about how to speak. But that's all their content is, how to speak. So if they're teaching someone how to speak, that person they're teaching how to speak has to have something to speak about. And if somebody's teaching someone how to write, unless they're going to write about writing, but not everyone can do that because that would get old, that person who's going to write still has something to write, needs to have something to write about. Or if someone's teaching digital marketing, they're digital marketing to get people to learn about digital marketing, but the person learning digital marketing has to have something to market. Or, you know, of course they can sell their digital marketing services, right? Just like a speaker can sell their speaking services by doing a speech, either about speaking or about something else, right? But eventually, most people have to have some other content than the fundamental skill that it is they're learning in order to share that content. So what I like about, well, what I said to myself is that I realized earlier today, I think, that self-dialogue is kind of a circular loop niche, because in having self-dialogue, people might start to have self-dialogue, right? That's kind of the thing. And then in order to share it is by having the self-dialogue, but what the self-dialogue is about is from one's own unique content, you know, one's life, one's process of processing information, the particular information one is curious about, and how that gets integrated into one's learning. And so self-dialogue is kind of a circular loop niche, because I'm not really writing about writing, and I'm not super great at writing. Now, self-dialogue is almost a new thing altogether, because it's not about speaking like, oh, first share your introduction and have 3 good stories, and then, you know, be vulnerable, and like all this stuff that's kind of like contrived that you have to like hold in mind in order to put these pieces of the puzzle together. So with this, like, I made a few notes, but putting it together is the dialogical consciousness, having dialogue and being able to come up with words and speak spontaneously in real time. So, you know, I'm like, okay, is this a circular loop niche? And, you know, it's about having dialogue with myself, having dialogue with Gaia, with what I'm learning. And so another circular loop niche is like teaching people how to be a coach, you know, and you're coaching people on how to coach. And then when you learn to coach, though, you need to coach about a certain niche, perhaps. So you still have to have some kind of fundamentals on which to put that thing, that skill around, right? Like, skills without some kind of content isn't going to help. So like, you could learn the skill of writing a book, but unless you have some idea of what you want to write a book about, it's not going to help. So the about